5 steps for improved metal materials. In this video, I've created 5 steps to get better and more physically accurate metal materials in Redshift using some important shader nodes. In step 1, we'll discuss a Fresnel-like shader node in detail so you fully understand how it works. We'll wrap up the section by making these metal tints a preset for gold, silver, nickel, copper, iron, platinum, titanium, magnesium, etc. so you never have to do it again. Step 2 will discuss the roughness channel. We'll add wear and tear to the surface like nicks, scratches, and swirl marks. In step 3, we'll add dimension to those artifacts by porting the imperfections into the bump channel to get realistic results. Step 4, we'll learn how to make the areas unaffected by wear and tear on the geometry that are naturally less exposed, like we see in real life. Lastly, in step 5, we'll make the shader a time-saving tool by adding quickly accessible controls and turn our shader into a full-on rigged preset for use in any project. This channel is new and your support is greatly appreciated. You can do so by smashing the like button if you find this content useful, and stay up to date with any new content I release by subscribing. Make sure you click that notification bell so you can see my community posts where I'll be sharing free resources. So let's dive in. So the first thing that you need to do to get an accurate metal material is make sure your lighting is correct. So I've applied a default standard material to my shader ball here. Not changed anything quite yet, but the first thing you want to do is you want to make sure the brightness values of your lights are accurately represented. So if I come into this color swatch and I compare the metal, this base color, and you can see it's gray, you can see that it's almost identical to the shader ball. So that's your first step. You want to make sure your brightness values on your lights are not too bright or too dark, and they're properly represented when you have the metal material turned down and you're just looking at the base, that you're not having any extreme highlights or anything that is overly exposed. We'll be adjusting the metal material here. The only thing I've changed is I've just brought down the roughness from 0.2 to 0.125. And in my shader, you can see I've got some nodes up at the top, these guys right here. These are going to be just commonly used nodes, and I like to have them placed up at the top so I don't have to search. Now, the node that we're going to be experimenting with can be found if you go into double click into the graph editor here and you go to utility. Under conversion, you'll see there's this IORtoMetalTint. You just drag it in and here is the node. Now how this works is you have the IOR and the absorption color. So these are two colors that work off each other to represent the metal material, and by default they're set to 1.5 across the board and then at 0 for the absorption. So if we were to plug this in, we go into the color channel is the facing, and then where do we do with this edge tint? Well, what we do is we need to expose the reflection color here. So I'm going to hold down Control or Command click the dot, not the keyframe but the dot, and that exposes the parameter. Next, what we do is we just plug this in, and you can see it just makes a dark color because these values are set pretty low. So I'm going to set this to 2, 2, and 2, and we get something a little bit brighter. Now, in order to get this to be a metal, we need to turn up our metalness in the base channel. We're going to turn it all the way up, and there you go. We have a dark metal, like a graphite. That is how this material shader node works. I'm going to delete this because I'm going to plug in my IORtoMetalTints that I've set up a preset for. And if I plug these in, you can see we get completely different results. So what's happening here is the IOR is basically showing, you can see here we have 3 different values, and these are RGB values. So red, green, and blue. And you can see that because we've turned down these values, we get this greenish color. Now, the absorption can also be thought of as the edge tint. So you can see it says edge tint. So this is the color of the edges. And you can see the edges, because these values are across the board the same value, we're going to get a gray color, which represents in metalness as a silver. How do these work? Well, in the IOR setting, the top one, the smaller the number, the more edge is going to be exposed. So you can see these values are a lot lower than you normally have them. And what that does is that brings the edge all the way over to here. So if I was to increase these to larger values, like 0.7, 0.7, you can see that that edge expanded out some. You can see the edge is further out. I'm going to undo this. This is really important at getting accurate metal reflections because when light hits the metal material, it reflects different colors in coordination with the angle to the camera. So you can see these polygons on the edge are facing away from the camera, and that's going to give a different material. So what I've done here is I've also plugged in some values into these sections here, and I've created some presets. So these presets I'm going to show how to make in a second, but if I go to like gold, you can see that we now have an accurate gold representation, and this is mathematically done using a special conversion. So if you're curious as to where I got these values, I've actually made a sheet for you to plug in these values. The link is in the description, and you can go through these and plug these values in. So I've named the slot the exact same as in the shader node. So what you do is if I want to copy, let's say aluminum, you click just once. So the text is not highlighted, but the cell, Command C, then you're going to go back here and then click once and do Command V. Okay. And what I do is I'll set the list side by side and then plug them in. So I split the screen up and I can quickly go back and forth. And it took me about 5 minutes to plug in all these values. If you're curious where I got this from, these values can be found on this site. And you can see I've got iron selected. So what you do is when you visit this site, you go down to 3D data for artists, select metals, and then you can come in here and say aluminum. And you can see aluminum has a different curve than, let's say, iron. IORtoMetalTint link will be in the description, and you can go ahead and make a preset out of those properties. So that's all I've done in here. And as I've just plugged in some of these here, like we can go to tungsten, and we can now get a tungsten carbide style metal material or silver. And these are mathematically accurate. So if we go to like nickel, you can see we get this kind of reddish orangey peach color that's to the metal. We can go to copper. There's our copper color. And you can see something, you might not be able to see this on video, but you can see the edge on this. These first values are set kind of low in these first two. So that allows more of this silver to encroach in on the edges. So it's reflecting like a silver color at these higher angles to the camera. Go ahead and select a couple more of these. So we can go to magnesium and we get a silver-like color. Let's see, there was one that so with this one, chromium, you can see the angles of these faces that are pointing away kind of reveal a kind of a purplish tinge to the edges. And this would be incredibly difficult to replicate. You'd have to use this Fresnel and then remap it and do some fancy stuff to get this. So this is where that IORtoMetalTints really comes into play. So what I suggest you do is visit the link in the description, plug in all these values so you always have them, and make a preset. So you enter in the values, and there's 6 of them. You plug in all 6. And you come down here and then you say save preset. And what I did is when you click save preset, I keep this original name in there and then just do a dash and then the metal material that I'm plugging in. So like magnesium or potassium or iron or whatever that is. So let's go to iron. You can see this one is really interesting. It's still got a little bit of that purplish tinge to it, but then the forward facing has a kind of a reddish color. It's very subtle. So this stuff really matters when you're doing object visualization and you need accurate metal colors. Going in and just picking a color in here is not going to give you the results that you want for accuracy. So you can find this node under utilities, conversion, IORtoMetalTints, or you can just type in IOR and it'll show up at the top. You can also see the presets show up underneath it. So if I know I'm going to do aluminum, I can just drag out aluminum and it's already plugged in. Okay, so let's move forward. Okay, so now that we've talked about the metal to tint, I want to briefly mention that you're wondering, well, there's an IOR here in this spot. What do I do with that? You can leave it to its default. It has no effect because it's being overridden by the edge tint color, giving us an IOR. So you can see here, if I turn up and down these values, it has no effect. So we can just leave this at 1.5. It has no effect. So let's build out the roughness and the bump channels. So up at the top here, I've got the color layer. So I'm going to duplicate that by Control or Command clicking and drag out a color layer. And I'm going to call this one Roughness Mixer. We're going to need another one. So I'm going to Command click and I'll call this Bump Mixer. And this shader is going to get very complicated. So I'm going to kind of space this stuff out to give us some space here. And when we look at the standard material here, we've got a slider for roughness. And what we want to do is with this roughness channel, with most metals, you're not going to want to go above like 50% or 0.5. Anything above 50%, it starts removing the roughness, or it appears though it's removing the roughness and the shininess of the material, and it basically turns it to a non-reflective surface. Our values, we want to clamp at 0.5 and under. Now, with real metals, unless you're doing a chrome surface, like a polished steel or whatever, you're never going to have a roughness that's below this value. So you want to keep those values in the 0.5 to somewhere around here, 0.03, okay? Anything lower than that, and it starts looking fake, like this looks too sharp in the reflections, there's always going to be some kind of surface disruption. We're going to take this roughness value and plug it in. And then our first color swatch, we're going to set it to its average roughness that we want. So I'm going to set this to something like here, like 25%. And if you are confused by the percentage values of the brightness levels versus here we're using a slider with the value here, what we can do is we can take and bring in a float value into our color swatch in our first base selection, plug that into the roughness, and then put 0.25, and that will give us the same result. So if you like seeing those float values, you can do that as well. So I'll minimize this, and I'm going to go ahead and add to this 5 color swatches. Okay, and we'll add the masks in later, and I'm going to now turn them off. So what we want to do is we want to add a series of noises to kind of augment the roughness channel. So I want to see variation in this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab in a noise here, and I'm going to keep this simple. You can build up something a lot more intricate, but I'm just going to create some simple roughness variation. So I'll put this into the color 1 channel, enable color 1, and you can see we've got some spots happening. So with this, we can pull down the amount and we'll see that we go back to the default. You can see we can slowly start including a little bit more of this noise to create variation. Now for this metal material, I'm going to select the blistered turbulence, which is just like the noise, but it has octaves to it. So those are layers of noise added into it that create more inconsistencies in our reflection. So you can see we already have a nice result. So if we're going for like a polished metal material or a brushed metal material, this is pretty nice just by its default. I'm going to set the blend mode to overlay. And what that does is gray values become transparent, and then brighter values become increasingly affected, and darker values increasingly become affected. So it leaves the middle values unchanged and makes them basically transparent. So I'll set this to like 0.25, and I'm going to adjust the size of this to 100 on the overall scale. So you can see the scale of this noise, if I hit solo, is rather large, and that's what we want. And let's go ahead and duplicate it, plug it into layer number 2, set the scale to 75, and then change the octave number to the next number so it's randomized. We'll enable number 2, set the blend mode to overlay, and pull it down. So there's another layer, and I'm going to go ahead and do this one more time. I'm going to scale this down to 50. Now, depending on if you're working at real world units, these overall scale sizes are going to be different than what you're putting in. I'm using the standard box size of 200 centimeters. So if I create a cube, you can see the cube fills the screen, but the scene is based off of that size. So my sizes are going to be rather large. Now, if you're doing real world, these values might be 0.5, 0.25, and 0.1. So they could be significantly different. So these are our noises to create the variation. You can see we already have a nice realistic metal variation happening. Now I'm going to go ahead and take a preset for gold. And these value amounts you can connect to sliders in our 5th phase of this assignment. So now that we've created some undulations in the surface reflection and some inconsistencies, which every material is going to have in the material making process of these industrial metals, they're all going to have inconsistencies. So if you're going for a hyper realistic effect where it looks like studio pictures of like a phone or some kind of tool or part, you're going to still want to add some noises and variation to the reflection like I've done here at the minimum. Now, if you're going for something that is more used or worn, you're going to want to include corners and edges and areas that aren't touched by humans, where they might be shinier, where they're less exposed, things like that. So because I'm doing gold, when you look at how gold is poured, there's always going to be a couple pock marks in there and inconsistencies on the edges. Plus, like a gold bar has nicks and stuff from it being moved around because the material is soft. Materials that are softer are obviously going to have more nicks and things like that in it. So if you're doing something like tungsten, which is a very, very hard metal, it's going to have less edge wear to it. In fact, it might be almost perfect. So those are some things to consider when you're developing this. If you want a more universal metal material that can be used on a lot of different stuff, you're going to want to include the bumps, the edges, the wear and tear on it, and then using the controllers, dial it back. So take into consideration the softness of the metal, the hardness scale of that metal when you're building these parts out. We're going to revisit the roughness channel in a second, but first let's go into the bump mixer here, which is the layer, the color layer, and we're going to just plug this in to a bump map. So drag it down, plug this in here, plug it into the bump, and off the bat, I'm going to just turn this down to something like 0.5. And for most metal materials, you're going to actually put this height scale of the bump map pretty low. In fact, on many projects, I'll have it as low as 0.005. So it can get very, very, very small. Don't be shy with pulling that value back to be a very minimal number. So I'm going to do 0.5 and leave it like that for now. So with this bump material, we want to include some of these disruptions into it. So we also want to have like little pock marks and scratches and whatnot. So that's where this is going to get pretty complicated. So the first thing I want to add to this bump map is some undulations in the material. So I'm going to take my max on noise here and just duplicate the first one, which was set kind of large, bring it into the color channel. And in the base color, because bump works by moving the surface up and down, the middle value of 50% gray is unaffected. Because we're going to be adding pock marks, which will go darker and deeper, we want a middle value so that we can go to blacks. And then areas that are brushed might have some lifted areas. So setting it to 50% will be unaffected in the bump. Let's go ahead and add our first layer for our bump channel. And you can see we've got some undulations happening. I'm going to set this to overlay, and then I'm going to just pull this value back. And I'm also going to, let's actually leave it up fully. And what I want to do is I want to create waviness. So I'm actually going to set this to noise, something very simple. And you can see the effect is very minimal, and that's what we want. We also want to bring down the scale to something like 50, maybe even a little less. Let's try 40, somewhere around there. So there's the waviness. So I'll call it wavy, and we'll bring this value down. So it's barely noticeable. 0.2. Let's put it to like 0.25, and there we go. So you can see just by adding a little bit of variation to the surface, when we add the scratches and whatnot, this will even be hidden a little bit more, but we want that surface articulation. The next thing we're going to add is these little pock marks. So I'm going to go ahead and do noise, add the max on noise. I'm going to solo it, plug it into color layer 2, all this pock marks, and these are going to be little holes. So let's scale up the size so we can see them. And for making the pock marks, I like using the displaced Voronoi. And what this does is it basically adds the Voronoi with a little bit of noise to it. So let's clamp these values. And I'm also going to bring down the octaves down to 2, which is how much detail it has. And I can even set this to 1. Yeah, let's do 1 in the octaves. So that's how much detail. And then what we're going to do is we're going to move the high clip. And what this does is this will separate the pockmark holes while adding a little bit of contrast to it. And so this low clip will just clamp in the black values, and then we can take this and then bring this value down until we get a couple little pock marks. Now, if you want these pock marks smaller or larger, you're going to have to go into these low clip and high clips to adjust. So we'll leave our settings the way they are. We're just going to bring down the pock mark size so we get something we like, something like 6, and we'll unsolo this and turn up the value here. So let's add the number 2, and there's our pock marks. Now, this value, depending on what kind of material that you're going to be doing, you're probably going to have it super low. So like somewhere around there would be a good start. Let's try 0.01. So incredibly low. And you can see there's a couple little pock marks here and so on. And this would be very natural to happen on a real soft material like gold. Okay, so the next bump that we're going to be adding is little nicks in the corners. So to do this, we're going to type in noise, solo it, and all this nicks. We'll add layer 3 in here, add the color, bring it in. Give ourselves a little bit of space here. And for this nix, I'm going to turn this up, and to get a kind of a geometrical nick in it, like if you were to take a soft metal and hit it against the corner of a table like a gold coin, it would create like a kind of a triangle shape because the metal is soft. So what we can do is we can select Voronoi 3, and that gives us this shape. And with this shape, this will create those kind of nicks that we're looking for. So I'm going to set this kind of low, like try 2 or 3. Somewhere around 2.5 looks good. And you can play with these values, obviously. If we enable it, which we did, and we'll unsolo, you can see we get these geometric kind of corners happening here, these triangle shapes. And this is what we want. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to now mask this on the corners. So I'm going to go ahead and take the mask, so command click, and let's build up that shader part. Okay, so we've added the mask in here. What we're going to do is we're going to take this and do another noise. And I like making these noises green, so I know it's a mask, so I can see down the chain. And I'm going to solo this. And to get this to work, what we're going to do is I find that I want to match the mask with that geometric shape. I'm going to take, and on this noise, I'm going to do a change range. And we're also going to do a curvature node. And what curvature is going to do is it's going to look at the curvature of the material. So I'm going to plug it into number 3 mask, solo it. And you can see by default, it's doing convex, which is the edge. If you select concave, it's going to do those inner parts. In my previous tutorial that I did, where it's called Get Better Edge Control, I discussed this radius and how we can control it. So this is based off of one of my previous videos that you can check out. I highly recommend it. And our curvature is going to be the last node before it goes into the mask. And then we're going to expose this radius. And what this will allow us to do is drive a noise into this input of the change range. And then the change range will make sure that radius gets clamped to a value that we want. So I'm going to plug it in here. And we're going to change our noise to a larger size. And you can see we're now using this noise to disrupt the edges. Bring in a value slider. I'll just steal this float here. I'll just take it from here. And I'll call this radius size. Plug it into the change range. And we're going to do it into the max value. Change range. So command click. And it should disappear because our float value is not set to 0.5. And there you go. So now we have a slider, an input value field that can change the width instead of doing it here. I'm also going to turn up the sample quality to 32, so it's a little bit better quality. And then what we can do is in this clip of the noise, we can start removing some of those edges. And also add contrast if we want. So you can see contrast gets rid of it. I'm going to leave that at 0. And just adjust the high clip and the low clip. So you can see if I do the high clip, it kind of spreads it out a little bit. So you can also put a slider in here for this low clip as a value to where it adjusts how much visible nick marks are there. So let's unsolo this. And you can see we now have nick marks that match. Now what we can do is in this noise, I can also select something like cell Voronoi, and you'll get more geometric shapes. So if I select the same noise that I used in the nicks, you'll get a geometric triangle shape as well. Let's do that, and then we'll just adjust this. Now you'll also notice a little bit of those triangles are showing through the material. So that is adjusted using the curvature remap. So what we can do is we can change the bias. So you can see as I go up, it shows more of those. So I'm just going to drag this down just a little bit. And you're going to want to go very slight with this value. You don't want to just slam it down because it will start removing some of these details. So 0.38 is good. And there's our nick marks. Now, I'll be honest, the noise that's happening here, it's inconsistently inconsistent. And you might want to add and stack up more noises, like bigger noises and smaller noises. So you could throw in another color layer in between this noise and maybe the change range and really develop a nice pattern. I'm going to keep it simple for now and just leave it as is. So there's our nick marks. Now with softer materials, these nicks make sense, like gold. So let's say you've got a harder material. These nicks would not make sense in something like aluminum would, but steel would have less nicks in it, and tungsten carbide would have the least amount because it is one of the strongest of metals. So we can just decrease this value to like 0.25, and you can see our nicks become a lot less noticeable. We can even go lower to 0.08, and there you go. You can see we have now just little nicks out of the corner, and this would be something good for steel. So I'm going to turn this up for the sake of the tutorial so we can see them. The next thing that we want to do is we want to add some disruptions in the surface for like scratch marks. And what I've done is I've created a resource for you that you can download, link in the description, for 3 substances that I created. You do not need to have an Adobe Substance license. You do if you want to augment them, but to import them into Cinema 4D, you don't have to have a license for Substance. And so that's why I created it, is so that I could share with you the same scratches and whatnot. So I've created 3 of them. There's Microscratches, larger scratch marks, and swirl marks. We're going to be using these 2, but if you're doing like car paint, these swirl marks are fantastic. Same with the Microscratches. This Scratch Marks Large has a lot of little details in it as well. So we're going to be using the Microscratches and the scratch marks. So if you go to the link in the description, you'll find these 3 in there. In order to get Substance loaded, double click, type in Substance Material, drag it out. And I'm going to put one up here because we're going to do this twice. So here's one, here's one. Need the load here. You'll notice there's nothing to plug in because we have not loaded the file. So I'm going to navigate to this inputs here where it says the file path, click the folder, and now we've loaded up the material. So now you can see what we get is we get a base color, a normal, a roughness, and a height. So base color is going to be white on black scratches. So anytime you need a white background with black scratches, you can use the base color. The normal is going to be used for normal bump maps. I find with scratches, normal doesn't look as good as height. You get a little bit more artifacting in it. So I prefer to, for micro scratches, use the height. Roughness is going to be black with white scratches because the way roughness works is black areas are perfectly shiny and white areas are 100%. So we're going to use the roughness for the swirls. So I'm going to go ahead and plug in roughness into the roughness mixer here, and I'll give it some space because we're going to add something in here. We're going to enable number 4, which is our swirl marks. And you can see it overtakes, the scratches overtake, because remember, the background on this roughness channel is black, which is 0% roughness. So if I set this to add, it will now take the white scratches and add them over the top of everything else that we have in here so far. If you set it to multiply, it does not give you what you want and will remove the transparency of the black areas. So what we want to do is we want to set this to add or screen. Screen is going to be less intense as add. And you can see now if I do before and after, it keeps the roughness of the underlying layers while including some of these scratches. So by default, the blurriness of this roughness in the scratches is 100%. We don't want that. So I'm going to go to like 0.5, which is, remember, the highest that I want to have those values. You can go a little higher. Actually, now I'm looking at it and you can play with these values. So I'm going to put 0.65. And with scratches, I want to be able to control the size of these scratches. Now, there are, under Substance 3D Material, you'll see we have the ability to change the render of the texture material. For this example, I think leaving it at 1024 is more than adequate. But if you find yourself having a tight shot where you're really close up, you can see they actually are kind of blurry. So what we can do is I'm going to turn off the Redshift IPR while I do this, because this has to recalculate and I've had it crash in the past. So I'm going to save first and then go to 102048. Wait a second for it to recalculate and then go to the Redshift and start IPR again. And you can see we now have sharper edges on those scratch marks. So it's all dependent on how close you're going to be because you're essentially scaling. Now, what I want to do is I want to scale down these scratch marks, and I did not include a scale in the material here. I figured it's not really necessary because what we can do is we can use a UV tile projection, plug this in, and then plug in this. And what this is going to do by default is it's going to scale them up. So what we'll do is we'll come in here and we're going to put 0.1, 0.1, 0.1 on the scale, and that scales it down. So the larger the number, the more repetitions, which means it's scaling down. So that feels pretty good. I think that size is good. And if you want to scale it down some, you can just put your cursor here, do 0.7, 0.07. Now, what I like doing is I like putting a scaler for this where I can just move one value. So I'll take my float, put 0.7, and with the UV projection, we'll expand it, command click or option click, drag in our value here into scale, and nothing should change. So now I have one slider that allows me to change the size. If I do 0.25, you can see the scratches get smaller. 0.05, scratches get larger, and I don't have to change a bunch of values. So I'll call this scale. So we also want to add these scratches into the bump map, the height map. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take and duplicate this UV projection because we're going to be taking the height. We'll plug that in. And now we can move this to here so that the scratches have the same scale and same positioning because it's using the scale value here. And we'll go to our bump mixer here, go to number 3 here, include number 4, plug it in, and it's going to go crazy. So if I zoom in here, you can see the bump is going in the correct direction, which is what we want, but it's really, really intense. So in order to fix this, we're just going to pull down this value, do something really, really low. So 0.03, and this is of course dependent on how close you are to the material. And there you go, there's the scratches added with the bump. So we could always increase this value if we want on the bump. And we can also take this mask value and expose it and say how much scratch. So what we can do is we can take this radius size, duplicate it, call this scratch amount, add the mask in here. Remember it's 0.04, plug that in. And there we go. So now we've included another control. I'll put this right next to it like that. So there's our scratches. Now I noticed that we're getting some distortions here in the material here because of the UV coordinates. So instead of using a UV projection, I'm going to use a triplanar, which I realized is a little bit more universal. So if you're working on a project that does not have UV coordinates, this is going to be a better alternative for you. So we'll command click and we're going to replace these here. So I'll take the color, drag it in, place. And we also want to do the scale here, match. And I'll do the same for this one. Drag in the scale, color, link it up. And now we have a better result. And this is actually going to be much better as a universal material for later down the road if we don't have a shape that has UV coordinates on them. And there we go. So there's our scratched metal surface. Now, what we can do is we can also add micro scratches. So these are going to be smaller little detailed scratches. So I'm going to take my substance material here, duplicate it, and I'll give a new link in here. So you go to inputs, select the material. I'm going to turn off the IPR, command save. You always want to save right before you do this because substance can crash on you and cause your project to fail. I loaded up the micro scratches and we'll go ahead and plug this into the next bump. I'll come in here to number 5, command click. Let's bring it down here so we can mess with it. Plug it into the height, turn on our IPR, and here is the micro scratches. So basically what we can do is we can experiment with the size is correct. We can bring up the scratch amount, which is just tiling, and that will make them smaller. And these are like swipe marks from like if you clean a surface like a car and you move your hand in a circular fashion, that will create those swirl marks. I scaled it down, but the width still looks pretty big. So I'm going to bring this down to like 120 and it has to recalculate. So make sure you save often when you're doing this. Also, we want larger scratch lengths. So I'm going to put this to like 1500 and that'll extend the length of the scratch mark. And now what we can do is we can just take this material and drag it out to here, and I'm going to insert a knot. So I'm going to do Control and Shift or Command and Shift and drag these knots out. And like that. So obviously the bump on this is really intense, so we can just pull it down until we get something that we like. So that helps break up the original scratches as well. So the large scratches are going to be kind of deeper and more intense. And then our micro scratches are going to be like recently created scratches. So somewhere around there, let's do 0.28. And then of course we want to set this to add scratch amount. We also want to set it to add, and there we go. So you can see this scratch looks pretty realistic to like a gold coin, right? If you ever had a gold coin, they scratch incredibly easy. So harder materials, you're going to go like a lot less with this. But that concludes this part. Let's move over to the roughness. And you can see I did the rerouter here, so I can bring up the reroutes to bring it over into our next one, which is going to be number 5. So I'll turn on number 5 for the roughness. And remember, we're going to do the roughness here, plug it in. And of course it overrides. So what we're going to do is we're going to set this to add or screen. Let's do screen. And now what it's doing is those areas that are scratched are roughening it up. So we can just pull this down a little bit. Let's do 0.65. And there we go. So here's how incredibly nice and easy this is to adjust. Let's say the client comes back at you and says, I like the scratches, I like the surface, but it's a little bit too soft on the reflections. You can just go in here and just bring this down, 0.125, and now you have a shinier surface, right? Like a newer gold coin. So we have this base value that you can always adjust. If you want something even more roughness, you can put 0.35. And there you go. So incredibly realistic and accurate. The next thing I want to talk about is areas that are untouched. So areas that would be like this crevasse here or crevice, this groove, and especially this one might not be touched as much. So it's going to get less scratches. So what we need to do is I'm going to give ourselves some space with these last two nodes, move them over, move this up. And what we're going to do is we're going to add, after this roughness mixer, one that removes the roughness. So to do that, we're going to take our color layer and add it in. And I'm going to call this polish. We're going to drag in our color mixer into the base. And we'll do this with just one step. So in this next layer, if I turn it on and plug it into the roughness, you can see we now have a shiny surface, so we can pull this value and mask this. To do this, I'm going to turn on the solo here. Let's do a curvature. And we'll solo it, plug it in. And the width of this is going to be how tight that edge is going to be. We want to also change the convex to concave. So here's the areas that will be untouched. So you can play with these and fiddle with these. Usually you want to kind of bring up the contrast a little bit so you get brighter whites. Do 1.5. And I'm just going to leave these by default. And I'm going to call this curvature polish. And now let's include this into the layer mixer. So if I solo it right now, it's just basically removing the whole shininess layer. So areas that are in the crevices are completely blurry. We want the opposite. So what we'll do is we're going to put in between the curvature polish an invert. So invert, I'm going to do color invert. And now we have like an ambient occlusion kind of an effect, but we're not using ambient occlusion. So next what we can do is we can set our blending mode, because remember, we're inverting this. So we want the blacks to be visible and the white areas to be transparent. So in order to do that, we set the blend mode to multiply. Multiply gets rid of whites and keeps the black. So if we look at this as soloed, you can see these areas that are in the crevasses are darker with the scratches. So we're not affecting the scratches. And there we go. So it might be kind of hard to see in this preview, but this crevasse right here is shinier. And now what's great is we can take this and let's say we want less shininess. We can just move this value to be unaffected or slightly affected or 100%. Now, if you want your scale to be bigger, we can just go into the polish here, go to our slider and say 0.1, and that softens it up. So what we'll do is we'll come into this polish here in the remap and we can pull down the min value like so, like that. And now we have even bigger radiuses. For realism, you're going to want to add variation to this. I'm not going to go ahead and do that, but it's the same process as we did here with the curvature and the change range and the noise. So you just do the same thing in the curvature. You add a radius in here. We just command click it, and then we add our change range and our max on noise. I'm going to leave it default and just run with it for now. Now we also want this effect to remove the scratches from the insides as well. So we'll go ahead and do that. So we'll add a number 6, command click. We want to remove the scratches. So we want actually, so what we're going to do is we're going to take this color invert and drag it in here, number 6, and then set this as well to multiply. And now we've removed some of the scratches in the corners as well and reduced it. Because this is overriding over the top, it's the last setting, it kind of clears out all the layers below it. And now we have a photorealistic setting that we can use, a preset. So now we have a completed material, and I could make this infinitely more complex, add more layers, add more disruptions, but I feel like this is a good jumping off point. And as you kind of work on projects, you might revisit this preset and add more detail, maybe add more noises, more curvature nodes to maybe add more nicks and things in the corners. It's totally up to you, but this thing can grow. This is a great foundation for growing a very complex material. It can be used on lots of projects. So what I suggest you do is go through your material here and find areas that you think you'll be adjusting a lot, like the swirl and scratch marks. So let's say the micro scratches on the roughness, I might want to change, or even better, the micro scratches on the bump. What we can do is we can expose this parameter. So here's our mask and it's 0.28. So I'll copy it, duplicate it, plug it into our mask, plug in their number. I'll call this micro scratch amount. The other thing you might want to adjust is this bump amount. So we'll add a value here, We'll expose the parameter, plug in the number, 0.5. Call this bump amount. Okay, so we highlighted the ones that we can quickly change in red. So what we can do next to make this controller much easier to adjust later is we can add a group node. So I'm going to just right click and say create empty group. And what this allows us to do is take these values and group them together. So I'm going to take my first one here, which is this roughness amount. Let's pick an obvious one. Let's do bump. So you kind of have to zoom out here. And we'll take this obvious one, which is bump amount, drag it in. And I'll rename this bump amount. And then in order to be able to click this and see the parameter here for the bump amount, what you do is you come in here to the folder and you just take this bump amount and just click and say add new input. And you want to make sure that this value, when you select it, says 0.05. And then to get out of this group, we come back by clicking the material here. And now you can see what we can do is I can select any of these right here and then select the group here. And you can see it says bump amount. So let's do another one here. Let's do scratch amount. Add new input, scratch amount. And we can come in here. And so I would link up a bunch of these and then you just come into this folder here and then you just click and say add new input. And you can see it plugs in that value we have and now we can adjust it. So let's say we've gone through all of these nodes and made settings for all of them, all the ones that make sense. What we can now do, let's just do one more. Let's do this radius size for the noise amount on the edges. So we'll come in here, add new input, and this is going to be the Nick corner radius. Corner radius noise. So we plugged in 3 so far. I'll come in here to the group, say add new input. And you can see we now have 3 parameters that we can adjust. So if I click here in this grid here, you can see it shows these settings. Well, if you get a really good metal material, you're not going to need to go in this very often, maybe to make a few adjustments. But for the most part, you want the user to just adjust these controls. So what we can do, lastly, once you've plugged in everything, is you can select the group node. Let's call it controller. And we can make it so anytime you create a layer, a new material using this preset, you'll get this list of settings that you can adjust. So what you do is you select the controller group here, then you go to node and you say start node. Click that, and now you can see it's a different color. And now anytime you select in this background, you see the properties that we made it and linked up. So let's add the base noise roughness. So this is a really important one. So this is the slider for the base roughness. Base roughness, go into our group, plug it in. And we can also change the order. So I actually want this one first. I'm going to just change the order here. There we go. So now you can see the base roughness is the first setting that we'd adjust. So if I want to come in here and select this group and say, I want a shinier surface, type 0.125, and now you can see it's working. Well, that concludes the video tutorial that I created for you on 5 steps to creating better metal materials and more accurately. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on more content. Thanks for your support.